Thank you. As Cassandra said, I'm Kelly Samick from the National Sea Grant Office. I'm the Competition Manager for Disaster Preparedness in Coastal Communities. In 2021, we began this partnership with NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration Disaster Preparedness Program to support Sea Grant program projects enabling communities to reduce disaster impacts and reach post-disaster recovery more quickly. Two of the projects selected in that first competition have now concluded: Wisconsin Sea Grant's Developing Preparedness Capacity in Wisconsin Coastal Communities Against Combined Storm and Flood Events, and MIT Sea Grant's Oil Spill Disaster Preparedness for Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe Coastal Aquaculture Operations and Cultural Resources. Today, the project leads for these efforts will discuss their approach, outputs, and what others can learn from their experiences. For Wisconsin, we'll be hearing from Jackson Parr, who's now a climate hazards planning educator with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension, working with rural communities in Wisconsin on extreme weather preparedness. He previously served as a fellow with Wisconsin Sea Grant within the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he worked with communities on flood resilience planning in coastal Great Lakes cities. We also have with us David A. Hart, the Associate Director for Extension for Wisconsin Sea Grant, for the Q&A portion of this presentation. On the MIT side, we have Danny Badger. As the Marine Extension Specialist for MIT Sea Grant, Danny Badger supports sustainable aquaculture in Massachusetts and beyond, drawing heavily on over a decade of leading marine science education initiatives at the New England Aquarium and degrees in fisheries science and natural resources. Danny seeks out the disconnects that inhibit aquaculture and facilitates opportunities to expand its reach, value, and resilience. I'll hand it over to you, gentlemen.
Great, thank you, everyone. So as Kelly mentioned, out of Wisconsin, we were working on a project focused on developing preparedness capacity for Northeast Wisconsin coastal communities against combined storm and flood events. And I'm joined here by David Hart, Associate Director for Extension at Wisconsin Sea Grant. So the project kind of overview, we focused on 9 cities, 7 county region in Northeast Wisconsin. Each of these cities here has some kind of riverine feature that feeds into either Green Bay or Lake Michigan. And as I'll talk a little bit about, we started to explore some of the implications of these combined lake level storm surge events and extreme precipitation riverine flooding events, because each of these cities has kind of that combined exposure there. And we had 3 phases to our project. The first is flood vulnerability analysis, kind of a technical analysis of extreme precipitation, some floodplain analysis, and communication of other studies that have taken place in the Northeast region to local communities. We also worked on community engagement using a disaster simulation exercise called the Extreme Event Game, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and then wrapped up with phase 3, running the plan integration for resilience scorecard process in the Northeast Wisconsin region, looking at kind of networks of plans and how well they collaboratively address topics of flood resilience. So I'm going to talk about each one of these a bit in turn. So phase 1, the flood vulnerability analysis, consisted of a few components, one of which was looking at historic and projected rainfall. We've reviewed the incidence of 2-inch rain events in Northeast Wisconsin. Northeast Wisconsin has largely avoided kind of the catastrophic extreme rain events, but we've seen a pretty significant increase in 2-inch rains, which is roughly associated with kind of the 1-year recurrence interval, something we'd expect to happen once a year. So these not completely severe, but still pretty intense rain events have been increasing across Northeast Wisconsin in each of the counties that we reviewed for this analysis. And we also looked at kind of a revision of current precipitation estimates using Dr. Dan Wright is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He developed what's called the Wisconsin Rainfall Project, which uses a stochastic storm transposition method to reevaluate extreme precipitation events using a more current precipitation history. So the table you see on the right is an example of one of our counties, O'Connell County, on the coast of Green Bay. And looking at the Atlas 14 recurrence interval estimates, Alice 14 calls a 5.3-inch rain event in Oconto County 100-year rainfall using the Wisconsin Rainfall Project data and analysis methods. Dr. Dan Wright identified, and we also found that the recurrence interval is actually more frequent, so more of like a 53-year rainfall for that same precipitation event. So this has pretty significant implications for things like infrastructure development, design standards for bridges, culverts, dams. So if these relatively extreme rain events are expected to happen more than are presently estimated, and we're kind of excited to see Atlas 15 in the coming years as well. We also conducted a flood exposure analysis. So the figure seen here is taken from a study that was done in Green Bay's East River watershed, kind of a notoriously flood-prone part of northeast Wisconsin. And we kind of adapted these findings. We weren't able to replicate this study in each of the communities that we worked with, but kind of communicating these findings to the other communities that were within our project area, given the similarities. And what this study essentially showed is that it reviewed the changes in the floodplain under various rainfall scenarios during times of high lake levels in Green Bay and low lake levels. So we've seen pretty volatile water levels in the Great Lakes over the past 10 or 15 years. And those fluctuating lake levels, particularly high lake levels, can have impacts on upstream riverine floodplain. And so this study kind of demonstrated, you see kind of a thin blue line is the floodway of the East River. That kind of darker blue area is going to be the floodplain under a 1-year rainfall scenario, about 2.4 inches in 24 hours. But that red area demonstrates where there's an additional flood inundation area during periods of high lake levels. So same rainfall, but if you adapt that or modify the lake level, we get a larger flood inundation area. Two kind of interesting things that came out of this study. One is that effect is more pronounced closer to the mouth of the river where it meets the Fox River and ultimately Green Bay. The effect essentially dissipates as you get further upstream. And additionally, this effect is less pronounced as the precipitation scenarios get more extreme. So there's kind of a smaller figure you see on the slide there that shows a 100-year precipitation scenario. And that expansion of the flood inundation area under high lake levels is less pronounced under more extreme precipitation events. So we worked to include this kind of analysis within our flood vulnerability reports that we produced for the 7-county region, and kind of communicating the fact that riverine features do in fact interact with the coastal areas and lake levels. We also produced a flood exposure index at the census block group level, so taking 7 different indicators of flood exposure, floodplain coverage, impervious surface, kind of trying to capture both fluvial and pluvial flood indicators. And we're able to map that onto the census block group level, which is going to be something of a recurring theme that I'll talk about. And we also did a demographic analysis, so looking at 19 demographic indicators across census block groups. Some of you might be familiar with the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. This has some similarities with that, but kind of importantly, we were able to drill down to the census block group level, whereas a lot of this data tends to live at the census tract level. And while that can be beneficial for urban areas where you can see spatial distribution of demographic data pretty well, in rural communities, the census tract is typically not at a high enough spatial resolution to kind of tell you anything about differences across the city. So the figure you see here is the city of Sheboygan, relatively large city on the Lake Michigan coast. But one of the cities in our project area, the city of Algoma, is about 3,000 population. And a single census tract covers that entire city. So you can't really see differences across the city in terms of demographic populations. So we were able to drill down to the census block group level in the city of Algoma. We can see kind of 3 or 4 different census block groups and start to get a better idea of what the demographic vulnerabilities might be across that relatively small rural community. And combining that, we were able to take the flood exposure index and combine that with the demographic vulnerability assessment and come up with kind of a combined view of both demographic and flood exposure vulnerability. You see an image of Oconto County there on the right, or the city of Oconto, I should say, kind of demonstrating a central downtown district that has this overlap of both high flood exposure and high demographic vulnerability characteristics. And that's further borne out in the chart you see on the left, shows across the approximately 215 census block groups that we reviewed for this analysis. The flood exposure index score and the demographic vulnerability score tend to be correlated. That red line kind of demonstrates that correlation. And this is something that's borne out fairly well in other literature, suggesting that areas of higher flood exposure tend to have populations with certain demographic vulnerabilities that make them less able to prepare for, respond to, recover from extreme events. So moving to our phase 2, doing kind of direct community engagement with the extreme event game. So the extreme event game was developed by the National Academy of Sciences. It is a social game, helps people build an understanding of the importance of coalitions for disaster resilience. It's something of a fictionalized disaster simulation that's really geared towards the general public and community organizations that are affected by disasters, or their organizations might be implicated during a disaster, but are not necessarily thinking about disaster preparedness in their day-to-day as a first responder or an emergency manager would be. So we work closely with the county emergency managers in our project area to host community flood preparedness events, which featured both the extreme event game and a presentation on the results of the flood vulnerability analyses in the respective counties. One space in which we found this to be particularly beneficial is this concept of VOADs, or sometimes they're called COADs, voluntary or community organizations active in disasters. And these are these loose networks of typically community organizations, business community representatives that agree to some level of coordination and collaboration in preparation or response or recovery from disaster events. And there's kind of different levels of intensity that these groups can take. Some simply maintain a phone tree that a county emergency manager can communicate with in times of a disaster to get an inventory of available resources. Other groups in counties in Wisconsin, pool resources and purchase equipment and materials to kind of support first responders while responding to disasters. So it's kind of any level of intensity of activity of these groups. But in our conversations with emergency managers in the region, we really found that they would like to have an active VOAD group in their county, but there's some limitations as far as recruitment resources and programming. So we viewed these community flood preparedness events as a way to both recruit and develop programming for these types of groups. And one of the biggest limitations to these groups being sustainable is that, what do you do in times of non-disaster? How do you maintain engagement with community organizations when there's not presently a disaster? So we use these community flood preparedness events both as recruitment, but also programming to kind of provide an opportunity for these organizations to both learn about flood vulnerability and risk, but also start building stronger coalitions and networks that can be then deployed during periods of disaster. And finally, phase 3, looking at the plan integration for resilient scorecard. So this is a methodology for identifying incongruities within networks of planning documents. So looking at networks of plans and identifying areas in which they may conflict on topics of hazard resilience. And kind of the methodology is first a technical analysis, looking at the network of plans, identifying the list of policies that have some bearing on disaster resilience. In our case, we viewed it specifically in terms of flood resilience. Mapping those terms onto districts, and then engaging in a scoring mechanism to identify areas, districts in which plans may conflict as they refer to disasters or have policies that affect disaster preparedness and resilience, and then layering on both physical and demographic vulnerability, which, if you recall back to the flood vulnerability analysis that we had produced, we kind of have those flood exposure scores at the census block group level and our demographic vulnerability analysis kind of in the back pockets. We were just a step ahead as we were getting into this process. And so application in our project area, first assembling the network of plans, we were fortunate to have the Bay Lake Regional Planning Commission as a formal partner on the project. Regional planning commissions in Wisconsin often serve as kind of the consulting planner on a variety of plan updates, comprehensive plans, hazard mitigation plans, and so really provided kind of a great resource for us to be able to tap into existing planning documents in the jurisdiction. And from there, generating a list of policies that have some kind of bearing on, in our case, flood resilience. So we identified across the 9 city comprehensive plans in our project area and the 7 county hazard mitigation plans. We pulled out all the policy statements within those that had some kind of bearing on flood resilience, identified if that effect negatively impacted resilience or otherwise increased vulnerabilities. And that was kind of our first step in this analysis. From there, we look at each of the policy statements, and there's kind of 3 legs to the stool that are required for a PERS plan integration for resilience scorecard analysis. You need to identify the kind of place-based term for that policy, whether that policy has an effect on vulnerability, and then it needs to have some kind of policy tool or the how that policy is going to be implemented or enforced. So as an example here, continue to enforce greater setbacks for properties adjacent to Lake Michigan under the county shoreline zoning ordinance. We identified we've got a place-specific term, properties adjacent to Lake Michigan. We can identify an effect on vulnerability, greater setbacks, likely improving resilience, reducing vulnerability. And our policy tool, how are we going to do all that? We're going to do it through the county shoreline zoning ordinance. We have kind of the 3 legs of the stool there. Another example, avoiding development in or near floodplains, wetlands, existing open spaces, conservation areas. And we had some limitations there. We have a place-specific term. We can point to where floodplains, wetlands, existing open spaces are on a map. Avoiding development in those environmentally sensitive areas would likely reduce vulnerability, increase resilience, but we're lacking our policy tool. How are we going to do that? Land use regulation, zoning code, some type of enforcement mechanism. That point was lacking. And really what we found is that these 3 legs of the stool, in many cases, as PERS requires them, were lacking in the comprehensive and hazard mitigation plans that we reviewed in our project area. So about 50% of the policy statements within comprehensive plans that had some bearing on flood resilience lacked one or more of these necessary criteria, particularly of note, lacking a mappable place-specific term, which really served as kind of a limitation to doing the complete plan integration for resilience scorecard analysis. So we took somewhat of an alternative approach, identifying each of the policy statements across all of our 9 comp plans and 7 hazard mitigation plans. We identified whether there's a place-specific term effect on resilience and a policy tool, and in places in which one or more of those points was lacking, we provided recommended language to kind of improve upon that policy, making a little bit more place-specific where appropriate, having some positive effect on resilience, and then identifying areas in which there might be a policy tool that can implement or enforce that action. And just a few considerations as we were going through this process. Policies that are not suitable for a PERS analysis does not necessarily mean that they are bad policies. There are many policies within comp and hazard mitigation plans that apply city or county-wide, and that might be appropriate. So lacking, the ability to point to something on a map doesn't necessarily mean, it should be thrown out or completely revised. Not every policy should necessarily consider hazard resilience. There are a variety of planning documents, and not everyone needs to consider impacts on resilience. It's really a way of the plan integration for resilience scorecard is really a way of evaluating those plans and making sure that they're talking to one another where appropriate. And then one opportunity we identified was really looking at what we've called statements of plan integration. And there's an example kind of in the bottom right there. Have recommended actions from this plan included in the implementation element of comprehensive plans of all jurisdictions in the planning area. So that language taken from one of our hazard mitigation plans is kind of an explicit statement of the philosophy of plan integration, which is, let's make sure that the hazard mitigation plan is being considered during the development of comprehensive plans, and that policies set forth in those comprehensive or other municipal plans are not in conflict with the goals and outcomes of the hazard mitigation plan. And I think there's an opportunity to develop more of these kind of statements of plan integration that can develop some kind of hierarchy of enforcement or deference when developing plans. So how it all fits together, our goal was to build community preparedness capacity in Northeast Wisconsin coastal communities, particularly in rural communities. There can be a lack of administrative and technical capacity. Developing the flood vulnerability analyses and providing some kind of technical analysis of rainfall and flood exposure and demographic vulnerabilities within these communities was a way of providing that data to the communities that otherwise might lack that kind of technical capacity. We look to build community capacity through programming like the Extreme Event Game. We have 6 folks across Wisconsin Sea Grant, the Bay Lake Regional Planning Commission, and Wisconsin Emergency Management that are trained facilitators in the Extreme Event Game and offer that as part of their programming. Again, to help potentially build up those VOAD groups, those kind of local and long-term standing groups in the counties that can participate in disaster preparedness and recovery. And then looking at administrative capacity. So building up the capacity for, and particularly the regional planning commissions, to engage in this philosophy of plan integration. So we identified, we were fortunate to work with the Bay Lake Regional Planning Commission, who, as I mentioned, is kind of the consulting planner on the vast majority of county and municipal planning documents in the region. And we identified that they're really a great scalable entity to implement this practice, whereas working directly with a local municipal planner is somewhat limited to that single jurisdiction. Whereas if we can build up the capacity, the skills to take this plan integration for resilience scorecard process, or even just the philosophy of plan integration to the regional planning commissions, we've immediately, at least in Northeast Wisconsin, kind of achieved a region-wide additional administrative capacity to engage in topics of flood resilience and planning. So across those another kind of 3 legs of the stool, if you will, looking at technical, community, and administrative capacity, all producing community preparedness in our communities. So I believe we're going to be doing questions at the end. So I think we're going to send it out to Massachusetts.
Thank you very much. And hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Danny Badger. I'm with MIT Sea Grant, the Marine Extension Specialist. And first, thank you to Cassandra and Kelly for putting all of this on. The NOAA Library Series, really love that we are exploring how to better prepare for disasters along our coasts. The Sea Grant program is really intended to ensure that we are supporting the sustainable use of our coastal resources, and the sustainability is not just environmental, but it's economic and cultural. And so what I'm going to explore today with you is a project we did to figure out how to better prepare for an oil spill when it happens around aquaculture and why that would matter. So to start off, why aquaculture? And aquaculture really is farming the ocean, or growing life in water, farming in water. And as we look to protect our resources, there really are few, if any, more important resources than our farmers. For if they're toast, the rest of our society is in big trouble. And so as we're looking to support a resilient coastline, we were aiming on them. As we look globally, aquaculture is a big deal. It has been growing substantially in past years. It recently caught up to wild fisheries in terms of how much we can get out of the water. And it is the world's fastest growing food sector. It also is a significant part of our economy in this country. About $4 billion of economic impact come from aquaculture, 22,000 jobs. And that interconnectivity is not just along the coast. It really reaches across throughout the country into landlocked areas as well. There's ways to connect pretty much everything that the U.S. cares about to a functional aquaculture industry. So we wanted to do well. Here in Massachusetts, where I am, we are no exception to the rule. We have seen a substantial growth to aquaculture, primarily in shellfish, primarily in oysters. In the past 15 years or so, it's really taken off, and it's gotten to a point where oysters are the third most valuable marine food product that we have. And the growing of these oysters and other shellfish has a significant impact on our economy. There's a 1.8 magnifier effect from what the farm gets to how it impacts the local economy. And beyond the pocketbook, there's a myriad of environmental and cultural benefits that aquaculture can provide, from supporting shellfish, recreational shellfishing. A lot of recreational shellfishing is reliant on aquaculture to a degree. Shellfish aquaculture especially is particularly powerful in that it can help clean bodies of water so that we have a healthier system that all of our community members enjoys and values. And shellfish can also be incorporated into a more resilient coastline, supporting fighting against coastal erosion and things along those lines. And then when we look at this state, we are mostly talking about small farms that are serving these roles. We have almost 400 farms in Massachusetts who all are, or most of them are 2 to 5 acres. They're all pretty small operations. They don't have deep pockets. So if a disaster comes along, they don't have a lot of resources to lean upon. And as we look to figure out how to protect these resources, we feel like it is essential, it is critical that you really do lean on the farmers, because they know that resource the best. They know how best to protect it, and they're fully vested into protecting it. As we were thinking of how do you protect aquaculture, we wanted to work with a group who recognized the value and the myriad of values that aquaculture can provide. Certainly, the economic element is important, but there were other elements we wanted to consider. So we partnered with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. They are headquartered on Cape Cod, and they have a farm in Wampanoag Bay on the south side of Cape Cod, where they are growing oysters and quahogs or hard clams. And the purpose of these farms are certainly to provide economic opportunity for tribal members. But beyond that, it's also the government. The tribal government has a responsibility to ensure food security, to feed their community, and the tribe sees it as their responsibility to clean the bay, to care for the bay. They have a deep cultural connection with ensuring that their operations within any system is in balance with a strong system. And they recognize that a lot of damage has been done to Wampanoag Bay, and they are keen on helping to remediate a lot of that. And that connection goes back thousands of years. So this was an ideal group for us to work with to ensure that we could be insightful of what would be needed to protect these valuable resources. And then the disaster that we're addressing at the moment is oil spills. And so give a little context of how oil spills can have a big impact. Looking at the Deepwater Horizon spill down in the Gulf, had a deleterious effect on the shellfishing down there. There wasn't a whole lot of aquaculture when that happened, but Louisiana saw a 50% drop in oyster production the year after Deepwater Horizon. That's about 7 million pounds of oysters that were not able to be harvested. Here in Massachusetts, we had a big spill back in 2003, the Boot Sharp B120, that was in Buzzards Bay. On the map here is Buzzards Bay, and for context, this is kind of the armpit of Cape Cod, and geographically, no other reason. And in the middle, on the northern side of the bay, in the middle is New Bedford, which is the country's most valuable fishing port. This is not a great area to have a spill, but there it happened. We saw substantial areas that were closed to shellfishing subsequent to the spill. a lot of impacts, not just to shellfishing, but to many parts of our communities. And one of the outcomes was that it led to the Oil Spill Act of 2004 in Massachusetts that directed the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, MassDEP, as well as others, to ensure we were better able to prevent, prepare for, and respond to oil spills. And that led to a pretty robust network of responses or response capability. The MassDEP has trained every municipality along the coast and equipped them with trailers that have oil spill response gear inside, so that if there was a spill, there is a whole swarm of responders who know what to do, have the equipment to do it, and can put a Band-Aid on the situation until the big contractors who have all of the professionals can come in and truly clean up an area. So they are stationed in every town along the coast of Massachusetts. And coupled with that are geographic response strategies for every embayment. It's pretty much a quick reference card that here, I'll move this so you don't have to see me, so you can see that better. It's a quick reference card that can inform those who are coming from out of town, who are the professional oil spill cleanup crew. They don't know the community very well, so it's a quick reference card to say these are the people who are engaged in important activities in the area. These are the resources that we are prioritizing in the area. This is where we recommend that you deploy gear to respond to this spill. And it's just kind of a recipe for response. And indeed, we need to do a lot of response. Just in 2021, in the southeast region of Massachusetts, there were 78 spills that were reported to MassDEP. And this is the epicenter of aquaculture for Massachusetts. Most of our aquaculture happens on Cape Cod, on the South Shore and South Coast. And so there's a lot of potential hazards interfering with a substantial part of our economy. And as it was pointed out to us by the NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration and Massachusetts DEP, they didn't really know what to do with aquaculture. It wasn't something that was in the mindset of oil spill responders, wasn't listed as a top area of priorities, and farmers didn't know how to engage in the oil spill response. As we cast about, seeing if anybody else had ideas on this, we heard from state agencies who desperately wanted answers on how to incorporate aquaculture, but had not done it extensively. And we heard this from Alaska to Louisiana, to Texas, to Washington. And a lot of federal agencies were really curious of how to incorporate this important resource, important activity along the coast. So we put in a proposal to build out guidance for farmers and for oil spill response trainers that could incorporate the knowledge and the resources that the farmers might have, that this tribe, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, might have, and ensure that we have a more robust posture to really respond. And this was funded by the National Sea Grant Office and NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration, the Disaster Preparedness Program. Willie Whitmore, the lead in the region for DPP, was instrumental in really identifying that there are a ton of people who already are set up to respond to oil spills, but they just aren't very familiar with this shellfish resource and what the impacts of a spill might be. So the way that we designed it was that we held a couple of workshops, 2-day workshops, where we incorporated the traditional training that is provided to towns. But we also wove in opportunities for different constituents, different groups, to share their knowledge of the resource, of the challenges that they may face. And ultimately, our goal was that we were going to set up the tribe to be able to protect their own resources, and not just the farm. One thing that really came out clear was the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe has a number of culturally significant sites that they are not prepared to share publicly where those are. That government should have the capacity to protect their own resources, be it the cultural sites or the farm. So enabling them, providing them the tools and the network to be able to do that protection while also contributing to that regional response was key to what we were aiming for. And a lot of this really boiled down to doing Aquaculture 101, Oil Spill 101, just what is the basics of what these groups are working with. And another big part was who else needs to be at the table. It was pretty striking when we were approached about this and conveyed that aquaculture was not part of the conversation in developing the geographic response strategies, that it was striking that constituent group had not been consulted before. Who else ought to be at the table, who have a ton of resources and a ton of assets that they need to protect in the event of a spill, that could contribute to developing these geographic response strategies. And through this, we also were weaving in how should the state regulators respond to a spill when it comes to shellfishing. We did find that there was no set rules there that could clarify this is how you close an area or when you should reopen an area. And that was a crucial part. That was something that we heard from Alabama, their Marine Resources Department, after Deepwater Horizon, that one of the biggest challenges was when do you reopen? And how do you do so in a way that ensures the public understands that reopening is based on data and knowledge of the true safety of this product. And as we worked through our workshops, there was several good takeaways we got. One of the big ones, which should not come as a surprise if you work with aquaculturists or fishermen, seasonality matters. It was very important to us that our farmers are working pretty much dawn till dusk at certain times of the year. So timing your training for the right time of year was essential to get full engagement. We also were struck that this could provide an opportunity to improve social license. So aquaculture often faces a number of roadblocks to its adoption because a variety of other community members don't understand or recognize the value that aquaculture can provide to that community and to the resources that they all value. And by bringing these previously disconnected groups together, encourage that dialogue, we certainly were opening up eyes of why this resource was something worthwhile to being in the community. When we were doing the training, one thing that came out was we focused on the farmers who manage the First Light Farm, the Mashpee Wampanoag's farm. We also brought in the shellfish managers for the town of Mashpee and Barnstable, which are the two towns that share Pompanesett Bay. We should have also brought in the other growers from the embayment, and that's something that we did in our second year, was reach out to other growers, because one of the beauties of aquaculture is that the farmers tend to play nice together. They recognize that while everybody's crops, it represents a financial asset for that individual farmer, it also has all of these other contributory elements that support a strong ecosystem on which those farms rely. So if there's a threat to one farm, other farmers want to help them out. And so if all of the farmers were on board understanding how to respond to a spill, they could then pool their resources a little bit better in the response of a spill. Maybe they protect just one area and gather up all of the products in one area and ensure that the damages for an embayment are minimized, and subsequently the litigation following all that will be minimized. One of the big challenges we ran into is that there are a lot of types of oil spills. It was kind of a sticking point for those who are experts in oil spills, because it was difficult for them to get out of the weeds of, well, there's this way an oil could impact the farm, or that way. Some oil floats, some oil sinks. There's a whole slew of situations people may encounter. That's what the contractors are for, who have the equipment and the know-how to respond to that variety of spills. It took us some time to massage to this point, but we really needed to hone in on what are those few oil types that you're going to see a lot as a farmer and how you might respond, what kind of gear you would need to protect your farm and respond to it. One of the cool pieces that came out of all this was that farmers make really good trainees for oil spill response. The company that was the contractor that was running our training element, the in the field training element, who was teaching the farmers how to deploy boom and other equipment to respond to a spill, noted that they have rarely seen people with better boat handling skills than these farmers. It's a reminder that aquaculturists have an incredible array of skills and assets that really ought to be considered as you want to develop the most robust response to a disaster as you can along the coast. As we went through our workshops, one of the things that we were really excited to see was that the growth of recognition about the value and the need to protect aquaculture in the event of a spill really increased substantially. At the beginning of these workshops, which there were a lot of Coast Guard, a lot of the traditional oil spill responders, they did not really know what aquaculture was. And shifting their viewpoints and understanding of how aquaculture could fit into that oil spill response posture was key. Part of that was incorporating farmers into the GRS planning committee. And that's one of the things that we were quite happy we were able to do. Immediately following the workshops, the Coast Guard enthusiastically invited 2 of the farmers to sit on that committee moving forward. And that was the first time the aquaculture had really been represented in the development of that geographic response strategy build out. We were able to equip the tribe with a response trailer and some of the equipment to protect their resources, and we certainly increased that communication. One of the big goals of this was to fill the gaps of the response network. Who needs to know who else is out there in this embayment, who needs to be incorporated into an oil spill response? I think one of the elements that was striking was that Mass Division of Marine Fisheries had not fully considered prior to this what they're going to do in the event of an oil spill. And so these workshops initiated that conversation and that exploration. And we're still developing some guidance for both farmers and for oil spill trainers on how to incorporate aquaculture and tribal knowledge or just local community knowledge into a truly robust oil spill response posture. And I've been able to share this out at the International Oil Spill Conference. As I mentioned earlier, aquaculture is kind of big all over the world. So making sure that this is an important resource that gets protected when there is a spill has been critical. So with that, I thank you, and I thank you to the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, the Mass DEP, and the Office of Response and Restoration were critical in the core team here developing this out. It was exciting when Division of Marine Fisheries hopped on and recognized the extreme value and need for this. Town of Mashpee and the U.S. Coast Guard were particularly enthusiastic, and then Moran Environmental provided the in the field training and also advised on which gear the farm would need. So not to go too extreme. You don't need to get all of the types of equipment. You just need enough equipment to protect the types of resources you have. So then again, you're putting the Band-Aid on until the big contractors can come in and help do the final cleanup. With that, thank you so much. I look forward to further discussion.
Audience, we have plenty of time to answer your questions, so please input them and I will upload them for our speakers to answer. And then I think to get us started, I have a question about, Jackson, you mentioned the extreme event game for disaster preparedness. I was curious, with that game, are the scenarios that get played out, are they sort of like canned scenarios that are very generic, or is it tailored to the location?
Yeah, so it is. The extreme event game does kind of take place in a fictionalized city, and participants are assigned a specific kind of role to play. as well as a neighborhood in which they live in. And so there's kind of this balancing of building coalitions and resource sharing, but there's also something of a competitive nature to it. So I think the greatest benefit I think it provides is allowing those who are not kind of in the day-to-day of disaster preparedness and are not thinking about extreme weather events regularly to consider how they might play out and what the importance of existing networks and coalitions and resource sharing is. So there's I think there's flood, earthquake, and tornado scenarios. As a facilitator, you have the kind of power to make kind of sudden catastrophes happen during the disaster that changes the way in which participants have to respond and adapt. So there's kind of a few different levers that as a facilitator you can pull to generate a little bit more activity based on what you're trying to do. So without describing the entire facilitator training, that's kind of the overview of how it works.
That sounds pretty cool. Thank you. Okay, well, I have another question while we wait to see what comes in. What would you say for your disaster preparedness in coastal communities, like the biggest challenge that you felt like you had to overcome when you were attempting to get the communities to engage with this?
I think it depended on every different audience had a different set of challenges. I think the biggest one is with the oil spill community. There are so many oil spill response community. There are so many other priorities along the coast that need to get considered in a response. And at times, the small mom and pop operation of a farm seem like a small potatoes. And it took a little while to really highlight how that farm had a value that extended far beyond just that one company's bottom line. And then kind of echoing what I said earlier too, of it can be daunting because there's so many different spills that you might encounter. Trying to whittle people down into let's make things tangible for the layperson, the person who's not going to have a professional career around oil spill response. They're trying to manage shellfish, and this just has to be part of a litany of response strategies they may have.
Yeah, I think I might echo a little bit of that in a different way, which is that local governments have a lot of responsibilities, and thinking about uncertain kind of long-term extreme weather events that are inherently uncertain in when they occur and where exactly they occur. It makes it difficult to kind of focus on issues of preparedness when those resources might be better allocated, or in their view might be better allocated to what they perceive as a more immediate need. And so I think kind of getting the engagement and trying to encourage them to consider this as an equal priority, thinking about flood resilience as an equal priority to, the litany of other obligations and public services that local governments are required to fund and provide, is definitely a challenge. When I present that, the recurrence interval that you thought was a 100-year recurrence interval is actually more of a 50, 60, 70 year, and maybe all of your culverts across the city are undersized. That's an expensive proposition. And so there's kind of this hesitance, I think, to engage in these topics when they can be so large, expensive, and in ways feel a little bit out of the control of a municipality of 5,000 people on coastal Lake Michigan. So.
Okay, thank you very much for your responses. We do have some questions that have come in. our first question, do you have advice for recent grads who want to get involved in climate hazards / climate resilience field?
Yeah, well, Dan, maybe I'm closer to the lived experience of that. I don't know. I'm only a few years out, so I'll take a crack. No, I mean, first of all, you're doing it because you're engaged in activities like these webinars, to understand what resources and organizations are out there. In my case, it was kind of picking a disaster and going all in on kind of topics of flooding and extreme precipitation. So I think, I'm biased towards uh, local government and rural areas, and I think that kind of starting to engage your municipal officials and staff on, talking to them about how they're considering uh, extreme weather, climate impacts, um, I think might open some doorways.
And I think one of the pieces that I've been given to pretty much everybody who's recently graduating in any field is there are so many people engaged in a response to any kind of disaster that the disciplines that get incorporated are really varied. And so you could find your way into a disaster response just as a captain, as a boat captain, or you can find it through being a whole other array of professions. So I think I have not been working directly with disaster response as a career, but what I have been working with is practitioners who are trying to deal with disasters amongst many other issues in their lives and recognize that it requires a jack of all trades on a community level, that we need to have a lot of different constituents in the room working on this stuff. And so you might find a pathway in unexpected avenues.
All right. Our next question is there a map of current aquaculture sites in Massachusetts?
I am sharing it now. This is there are maps of current aquaculture, but just in a generalized sense here, the darker areas are where there are more leaseholders, small farms than others. And as you can see, the vast majority are in the southeastern part of the state.
And then our next question, could you both speak to what strategies you use to engage with communities that you may not have already been engaged with?
One thing that I'll do is, it is always really difficult going into a new community. They're going to view you as, there's a good danger of them viewing you as out of touch or coming in to preach how things need to be done, even though you're an outsider and you don't really know. And I think the most important piece is humility. And I'll go in and just, I want to be a fly on the wall. I want to help you out. I want to spend a day working with you, and I'll buy you lunch as we go along, and then maybe you can just tell me some of the challenges you're facing. And the main crux of it is, don't go in with an agenda other than just to build that relationship, because if you can only do this work with a trusting relationship, and that requires you not to have a preconceived agenda, I think.
Yeah, I would completely echo that. I mean, I think that coming from a flagship institution from the state capital into rural communities, there's kind of an inherent defensiveness, I think, that goes up, and coming in with an idea that, because I have a certain position title, I have the answer, is fairly misguided, and that the people on the ground there, the community members that you're working with, are the ones with the information that will get you to an answer. So it's really just incumbent to sit and listen. And I also find, knowing as much as you can about their small town before arriving, knowing the names of the highways, or being able to reference the school mascot. There was some of that kind of it demonstrates that you took at least some time to get to know the place in which you're going to be working. So that'd be my advice.
Okay. The next question. I'm interested in the application of aquaculture preparedness in other regions. Where have you already shared your work or envision this work being applied?
So I've shared it at the International Oil Spill Conference last year. It will also be, we'll probably be sharing it again in the Northeast Aquaculture Extension Conference next January. But then as we develop that best management practice document, that we intend to disseminate through the Sea Grant Network, and it will be effectively like a white paper that's available on our website, but it's not there yet. I envision this happening. I mean, really, it should happen in every coastal region, that you incorporate those constituents who are deeply knowledgeable and reliant on the water into your oil spill response strategy development.
And we are right at 4:00. That is great timing. Thank you again, Jackson, Danny, and David, for sharing your work with us today and answering questions. Thank you, Kelly, for organizing this event. Audience, we hope to see you at our next library seminar. Thank you all for attending, and have a great rest of your day.